Why did you do that?
Amidst the chaotic symphony of wailing electronic alarms, a human voice cut through, sharp and filled with disbelief. It was a question that pierced the unfolding absurdity, and then a reply, almost a reflex, short, decisive.
I didn't do it.
After those two sentences, human silence fell. All that remained was the escalating scream of the machinery, sounds programmed to announce an inevitable death. This was the final conversation, a ghostly drama that lasted only a few seconds. Recorded in the cockpit of Air India Flight 171, it is the only legacy left before the aircraft and the 260 souls aboard were wiped from the sky. A question, a denial, not a word of explanation, a mystery sealed forever in fire and metal. So, what was that? What act could be so horrific as to make a modern Boeing 787 Dreamliner a technological marvel and the pride of the aviation industry fall like a stone less than a minute after takeoff? The answer that international investigators found inside the two reinforced black boxes was more terrifying than the wildest theories. A chilling truth, an act that defied all logic, all safety protocols, all hours of flight training. At the very moment the wheels had just left the tarmac, during the most critical phase of the flight, someone, or something, had performed an unthinkable action, flipping both fuel cutoff switches for both engines. Take a moment to fully grasp this. In a modern cockpit, there are buttons and switches you use constantly, but there are also switches considered inviolable during flight. The fuel cutoff switch is the king of those forbidden zones. The engine is the heart of the plane. Fuel is the blood that feeds that heart, and this switch, in essence, is a guillotine valve that instantly stops the blood flow. It is the kill switch, the final action a pilot takes to put the giant machine to rest after a safe landing. After taxiing to the gate, after the mission is complete, because of its critical importance, engineers designed a two-step safety mechanism. You cannot activate it by accident. You must perform a conscious act. Your fingers must deliberately lift a small latch at the base of the switch to unlock it, and only then can you decisively flip it down to the cutoff position. And yet, on Flight 171, that two-step, deliberate action was performed, not once, but twice, for both engines, at the worst possible moment. The result was a tragedy broadcast across the world. That June, in the city of Ahmedabad, India, people on the ground looked up to witness an unbelievable sight, the massive Dreamliner. Instead of continuing its ascent, shuddered in midair and then plummeted into a densely populated residential area from an altitude of just 625 feet. The ground turned into a scene from hell, fire, smoke, and utter panic. 260 people, 260 stories, 260 families, 260 separate worlds would never land. To understand the chilling absurdity of this tragedy, we need to take a step back. We need to look at the very act that millions of us perform every day, stepping into a giant metal tube and entrusting our lives to it. Where is our faith truly placed? It is an unwritten covenant, a pact of trust in an invisible system. Every time we settle into a narrow seat, feel the cold, conditioned air, and hear the final click of the seatbelt, we aren't just trusting the two strangers we've never seen in the cockpit. We are betting our lives on a complex network of thousands of other people. We trust the designers who spent millions of hours on aerodynamic calculations. We trust the software engineers who wrote millions of lines of flight control code. We trust the factory workers who meticulously assembled thousands of bolts. We trust the mechanic who stayed up the night before to inspect the engines. We trust the air traffic controllers, for whom we are merely a blip on a radar screen. And then, the plane awakens. A gentle vibration spreads. You hear the roar of the jet engines grow, from an initial whine to a deep, powerful rumble, and finally, a scream that tears through the night. Your back is pressed deep into your seat. It is a terrifying, controlled power, a controlled explosion, conquering the most fundamental law of the universe, gravity. The city below becomes a sparkling tapestry, a world you've just left behind. You are flying. It's a miracle of technology, a familiar ritual built entirely on the foundation that everything will work exactly as designed. But Flight 171 proved, in the most brutal way, that this covenant can be broken, not by a storm or a complex technical failure, but by an act so simple a child could do it. And it leaves us with a haunting mystery. One of the two people in the cockpit acted, and then lied in the final seconds of their life. Or, one person acted in an inexplicable, unconscious state, and the other could only utter a question in absolute horror. Or, there is a third possibility, a possibility that transcends human error, a possibility even more frightening than a deliberate lie. That is, if both of them were telling the truth. I bet you're doing what I'm doing right now. You're replaying those two sentences in your head, trying to hear a nuance, a tremor, something that reveals the truth. You're trying to be a juror in the courtroom of your own mind. We are standing before three doors, three possibilities leading to different abysses of truth. The first door, the lie. This is the simplest, most familiar scenario in human stories, and also the cruelest. One person did it, perhaps out of malice, panic, or for a reason we will never know, and then denied it. This scenario is understandable. It gives us a villain, a single bad apple. It helps us believe the system is still safe, that it was just a flawed individual. The second door, the horrifying mistake. This scenario is more disturbing. No one is lying, but one person acted unconsciously, an unimaginable mix-up, a betrayal by their own body. This scenario is more frightening because it's no longer about choice, but about inherent human fragility. It touches the deep-seated fear that no matter how well trained we are, our bodies and minds can still fail us at the most critical moment. And then, there is the third door, the door that perhaps you and I are most hesitant to open, because it leads to a place dark and strange. The possibility that they were both telling the truth, that neither of them flipped the switches, but the switches were flipped anyway. This is no longer a human story. It is a story about a ghost in the machine, a rebellion of logic, a catastrophic system failure within the very creations we have built and blindly trusted. This places us, awake in the night, before one of the core questions of our time, when human testimony and machine data contradict each other. Where do you place your faith? In the complexity, the hidden corners, the emotions, and the infinite capacity for error of the human psyche? Or in the cold, seemingly infallible logic of the machines that were, themselves, created by humans? I truly await your thoughts in the comments. This story has many more layers of mystery, and if you, like me, feel that this is more than just a news report, but something that needs to be understood, then please subscribe and like this video to join me on the rest of this journey. Are you ready? Because in the next part, we will temporarily set aside the machines and look deep into the eyes of the first ghost. Is it possible one of the pilots was lying? We will explore their lives and the unimaginable pressure inside a cockpit. Two souls in the cockpit. When the words of humans and the data of machines contradict. That was the question we left off with in the previous part. A question hanging in the air, as heavy as a thundercloud. If the machine isn't lying, if the data wasn't fabricated, then the finger of logic inevitably points to the cockpit, to the two human beings sitting there. Tonight, We will do something very difficult. We will step through that reinforced cockpit door, not as investigators seeking evidence, but as silent observers, trying to understand a space known as the loneliest place in the world. The cockpit of a commercial airliner is not just a workplace. It is a sacred space, a place where two individuals, who may have been complete strangers before the flight, must form an instant bond, in absolute trust. They are two halves of a single brain, responsible for hundreds of lives behind them. Every word, every action, every nod is governed by an unwritten set of rules called crew resource management. It is a complex dance of communication, cross-checking, and mutual support, designed to eliminate human error. In that sacred space, the final conversation on Flight 171 was not just a disagreement. It was a fracture, a crack in the very foundation of trust. Why did you do it? Let's analyze that question. It isn't what's happening, nor is it are we in trouble. It is a direct accusation. One person, in the midst of chaos and horror, saw an inexplicable act and attributed responsibility to the person sitting next to him. He believed he had seen the cause of the disaster. I didn't, and this is the denial. It is not an explanation. It is not I accidentally touched it or I was confused. It is a total negation, a wall erected instantly, in a life or death moment. One pilot says you did it, and the other says I didn't. In a tragedy, humans have an almost instinctual tendency to find an understandable cause. And the most understandable, most familiar cause is human error. A car accident, the driver was drunk. A company goes bankrupt, the CEO made a bad decision. A bridge collapses, the engineer was careless. Attributing blame to a bad apple helps us believe that the rest of the apple basket is still safe. It helps us maintain the belief that the system, fundamentally, still works. And in aviation history, pilot error is often the final conclusion in many accidents. So, does the specter of accusation in this story truly point to one of the two pilots? To answer, we must try to sketch their portraits, even if only with the faint outlines from the report. The preliminary report is clear. Both pilots and the crew had passed breathalyzer tests before the flight. They were completely sober. The report also states they had adequate rest. They flew from Mumbai to Ahmedabad the day before, checked into a hotel, and had enough time to recover. They were not in a state of exhaustion. Let's try to imagine their last 24 hours. A normal day, like any other in the life of a pilot. They might have called home, talked to their children. They might have had dinner together at the hotel restaurant, making small talk about flight schedules, about other colleagues, about an upcoming cricket match. The next morning, they met in the crew briefing room, received the parameters for the weather, for the aircraft's weight, a series of procedures or checklists, performed mechanically, masterfully. That is the nature of being a pilot, a profession built on repetition and discipline. Thousands of hours in simulators, practicing hundreds of emergency scenarios over and over, from engine failure to hydraulic system failure to fires. The goal of all that training is to turn their reactions into reflexes, so that in a crisis, they don't think, they act. They act according to the procedures that have been etched into their minds. So, how could two such highly trained professionals, in a completely normal cockpit, with no prior warnings of any malfunction, perform an act that goes against every basic procedure? Aviation experts are as baffled as we are. Sean Pruchnicki, a former airline accident investigator, said that pilot confusion usually occurs when they are already dealing with another emergency, when they are overwhelmed with information and pressure. But here, there was no indication of that. The cockpit was completely quiet until the disaster struck. He said, "This kind of error doesn't typically happen without some evident issue." Peter Goals, a former managing director of the US NTSB, went even further. He called the finding very disturbing and said that a pilot shutting off the fuel switch just seconds after takeoff is something almost unbelievable. This pushes us into a dark area, an abyss of speculation that no one wants to explore, the possibility of an intentional act. This is an extremely dangerous and sensitive path. There is no evidence in the articles to suggest this, but as silent observers, we must admit that this is one of the logical possibilities. However terrifying it may be, the aviation industry has witnessed tragedies like the Germanwings flight in 2015, where the co-pilot intentionally locked the captain out and crashed the plane into a mountain. However, that scenario doesn't seem to fit with what we know about Flight 171. First, there is the denial on the CVR. If someone intended suicide and destruction, why would they deny their action to their colleague in their final moments? Second, and more importantly, the data shows that the fuel switches were flipped back to the run position. This indicates a desperate attempt to correct the mistake, to restart the engines, to save the aircraft. It doesn't look like the act of someone who wants to destroy. It looks like the act of someone who realized a terrible mistake had just happened and was trying in vain to reverse it. This contradiction makes the mystery even denser. It is not a simple story of a villain. It is much more complex than that. It is because of this complexity and sensitivity that the pilot associations and the CEO of Air India himself have had to speak out. They have urged the public and the media to be cautious, not to jump to conclusions, especially baseless speculation about the pilot's actions. They understand that while the technical investigation is searching for a cause, a public investigation can quickly turn into a witch hunt, causing immense pain to families who are already broken. And the final, coldest truth is that we still know nothing. The investigators have not yet been able to identify the voices on the tape. No one knows who asked. No one knows who answered. Without that evidence, any attempt to assign responsibility to one of the two people in that cockpit is pure speculation. The two pilots of Flight 171 have now become ghosts. They are the center of the story, but their portraits are completely invisible. We cannot look into their eyes to find the truth. We can only listen to their echoes in the silence. I know you're doing the same thing right now. You're replaying that ghostly dialogue in your head, trying to hear a nuance, a tremor, something that reveals the truth. Your mind, by its very nature, is a storytelling machine. It hates voids. It hates chaos. It craves a narrative with order, and it's trying to write one right now. Is your mind doing this, too? For a moment, it paints the scenario of a hero. Perhaps one pilot discovered his colleague doing the unthinkable, and the question, "Why did you do it?" was a final, desperate attempt to intervene. Then, a moment later, it flips to a darker page, painting a villain, someone who acted, and whose denial "I didn't" was a cold-blooded lie in their final seconds. Why does our mind automatically run in these two directions? Why do we have such a strong urge to find someone to blame, or someone to praise? Because a story, no matter how tragic, still provides a sense of order. It has characters, motives, a cause and an effect. It is far more comforting than the third possibility, the possibility that sometimes a tragedy is simply a chain of mistaken, meaningless events, with no clear hero or villain. Could it be that confronting randomness, chaos, and the absence of a story with a beginning, middle, and end is more terrifying than finding a horrible truth, a truth that can be punished, that can be understood? What is your mind choosing to believe? Do you need a story with heroes and villains to feel that the world is still in order? Or can you accept a truth that has no meaning? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We have looked into the human mind and found only a curtain of fog. Perhaps it's time we stop looking at the pilots and started looking at the very machine they were flying. The ghost in the blueprint. In the last part, we entered the cramped space of the cockpit and looked at the two specters of accusation. We tried to sketch their portraits, but in the end, only a fog of ambiguity remained. Their accusation and denial echo in the silence. Without resolution, the human mind, with all its complexity, has become a dead end. So, the investigation must pivot. When the human becomes an unsolvable variable, one must start looking at the only thing left, the machine. Tonight, we will no longer speak of human psychology. We will speak of metal, of wires, of blueprints and lines of code. We will search for a different kind of ghost, a ghost not born of emotion, but of calculation, a ghost in the blueprint. Let's talk about the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. The dream of flight. It is not just an airplane. It is a marvel of modern engineering. Its fuselage is made of composite materials that are lighter and stronger. Its wings can flex gracefully like a bird's. Its cockpit is a symphony of digital screens, where millions of lines of code work in harmony to create the smoothest, most efficient flight possible. It is a symbol of perfection, of humanity's absolute control over matter. A machine created by the most brilliant minds, with a single goal, safety and reliability. But in the world of engineering, there is a concept called latent failure. It is not a visible crack, not an engine on fire. A latent failure is like a flawed gene in the machine's DNA. It lies dormant, year after year, for thousands of flights. It is harmless, until, and only until, a perfect set of conditions occurs, an unlucky chain of events aligns, and then, that tiny, forgotten flaw will awaken and cause a catastrophic chain reaction. The search for the ghost in the blueprint is the search for these latent failures. And the investigators of Flight 171 found such a thing. A small detail, buried in thousands of pages of technical documents, a warning from the past. December 2018, nearly 6 years before the tragedy, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration issued a document with the code SAIB 1820. SAIB stands for Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin. This bulletin, notably, highlighted that some fuel control switches on the Boeing 737 series were found to have been installed with the safety lock feature disengaged. Remember the switch we talked about in part 1, the switch that requires the pilot to perform a two-step action. Pull the latch up, then flip it down. The FAA's bulletin said that on some aircraft, that locking latch might not have been working from the start. That means the switch could be flipped down with just a gentle push, instead of a deliberate two-step action. And here is the most crucial detail. The bulletin also noted that this switch design is also used on the Boeing 787-8 aircraft, the exact type that crashed. A warning, a spark in the darkness, a ghost that had announced itself. But in the bureaucratic and complex world of aviation, not all warnings carry the same weight. There are two main types of documents. One is an AD, Airworthiness Directive, and the other is an SAIB, Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin. An Airworthiness Directive is a command. It is legally binding. When the FAA issues an AD, airlines are required to comply. They must inspect, repair, or replace the faulty part within a certain period. If not, the aircraft will not be allowed to take off. It is a sledgehammer from the regulatory body. But a Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin is different. It's like a gentle tap on the shoulder. It is a recommendation. The FAA is saying, hey folks, we found a potential issue. It's not serious enough for us to order you to ground your planes immediately, but you should check it out when you get a chance. The document SAIB 1820 regarding the fuel switch flaw was only a recommendation. It was not a command, and because it was only a recommendation, the preliminary report states, Air India did not perform the suggested inspections on the aircraft with the registration number VTMB, the one that crashed in Ahmedabad. Why? We, as outsiders, might be immediately outraged. Why not inspect a safety-related issue? But let's try, for a moment, to put ourselves in the shoes of a global airline. Each aircraft is a money-making machine worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every hour a plane is on the ground for inspection, instead of flying in the sky, is a huge loss. Performing an inspection across the entire fleet, even a small one, requires costs in terms of manpower, time, and could disrupt complex flight schedules planned months in advance. Airlines and regulatory agencies are always balancing on a thin line, the line between absolute safety and economic efficiency. They live by calculating risk. What is the percentage risk of an incident? What is the cost to eliminate that risk? If the probability of a certain failure is 1 in a million, and the cost to inspect it is millions of dollars, what will they do? It is a cold calculation, a calculation we never want to think about when we are on a flight. It's always happening behind the scenes. In this case, the FAA judged that the risk was not great enough to issue a command, and Air India, based on that judgment, decided not to act. And now, the million-dollar question facing investigators is that latent flaw in the SAIB bulletin the key to unlocking the tragedy? Here, even the experts are divided. One school of thought, represented by Mr. Sean Pruchnicki, looks at this with deep suspicion. He wonders, what does this mean? Does it mean that with just a gentle flip, that switch could shut off the engine and cut the fuel supply? When the locking feature is disengaged, what exactly happens? Could the switch just flip itself to the off position and shut down the engine? If the answer is yes, then this is no longer a minor flaw. This is a time bomb installed in every cockpit, a loaded gun waiting for a slight nudge and unusual vibration, an accidental movement by the pilot in a moment of fatigue to fire. But there is another, more cautious school of thought. Mr. Peter Gold suggests this might just be a distraction. He said, I haven't heard of this. It seems to be a low-profile FAA issuance. I also haven't heard any complaints about the fuel switches from pilots, who are usually quick to speak up. By this logic, if this were truly a serious problem, then in the millions of flight hours of hundreds of Dreamliners around the world, someone should have noticed. Its mention in the report is worth considering, but it could just be a dead end, a coincidence that distracts investigators from the real cause. And it is at this moment that a third ghost appears, a ghost even more abstract and elusive than a mechanical flaw. Captain Kishore Chinta, a former investigator with India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, posed a different question, a question that goes straight to the heart of modern machines. Could the fuel cutoff switches be triggered electronically by the plane's control unit without any movement by the pilot? This is a completely different possibility. The problem is no longer in the physical locking latch, not in the mechanical design. The problem lies in the electronic brain of the aircraft. Modern aircraft like the Boeing 787 are no longer purely mechanical machines. They're flying supercomputers. Pilots do not directly fly the plane in the traditional sense. They make requests to the system. They move a lever, and an electronic signal is sent to the central computer. The computer analyzes that request, compares it with thousands of other parameters, and only then commands the actuators to operate. This automation system has made aviation incredibly safe. It has eliminated countless human errors, but it has also created a new, more complex type of risk. What happens when that system, that electronic brain, makes a wrong decision on its own? A faulty chip, a conflicting line of code, could create a ghost command, a command never requested by the pilots. Is it possible that the electronic brain of Flight 171 ordered itself to stop breathing? The ghost is no longer in the pilot's mind. It is no longer in the mechanical design of the switch. It is somewhere in the millions of lines of code, in the intricate circuits that the naked eye cannot see. A ghost in the chip. So, our journey of seeking has taken us through 3 doors. And perhaps, at this moment, your mind, like mine, is standing at a 3-way fork in the road, shrouded in fog, unsure of which direction to turn. The first door, the door of the human mind. We stepped in there and found only an unresolvable contradiction, an accusation and a denial echoing in the silence. It leaves us unsettled because it touches upon the complexity and fragility of human nature itself. The second door, the door of the mechanical blueprint. We stepped in there and found a neglected warning, a decision made based on the cold calculus of risk. It leaves us indignant because it touches upon our sense of helplessness before systems larger than ourselves. And the third door, the door of the machine's electronic brain. We stepped in there and found only an abyss of complexity, a ghost in the chips that we may never fully comprehend. It leaves us afraid because it touches upon our anxiety about a future where we are no longer in control. 3 doors, 3 different fears. So in an increasingly automated world, where we entrust more and more decisions to algorithms and smart systems, what do we truly fear more? The mistake of a human that we can understand, that we can sympathize with, and that we can punish, or the rebellion of a machine that we cannot explain? A strange and cold logic making decisions for us? Which fear is keeping you more awake tonight? Please leave your thoughts in the comments, as this conversation needs your voice. We have dissected the possibilities. We have walked down every path of doubt. Now it's time to face the unchangeable reality. It's time to return to the cockpit, in the final seconds, to witness the inevitable collapse. Together, we will perform an anatomy of a fall. Anatomy of a fall. In the last part, we left the cockpit to search for ghosts in the blueprint. We leafed through safety bulletins, pondered potential mechanical flaws, and wondered about the role of soulless microchips. That search left us with theories, possibilities, but no certain answers. Tonight, we return. We will no longer speculate. We will only observe. We will use the few fragments of information from the preliminary report to try to reconstruct one of the shortest and most terrifying periods a human can experience. Less than a minute, that was the entire existence of Air India Flight 171. From the moment its wheels left the ground until it vanished in a ball of fire. 1 minute, 60 seconds, enough time to listen to the chorus of your favorite song. Enough time to wait at a red light, and also enough time for a dream of flight to turn into a nightmare. Let's dissect those 60 fateful seconds together. Second 0. The Dreamliner's wheels leave the runway. In the cockpit, this is a moment of transition. One pilot will call out, "positive rate," confirming that the aircraft is indeed climbing. The other pilot will respond, "gear up," and flip a lever to retract the landing gear. These are rituals, a dance performed thousands of times, a seamless interaction between man and machine. Outside, passengers feel a sense of weightlessness, the feeling that the earth has let them go. Seconds 10 to 20. The aircraft is at an altitude of a few hundred feet. The engines are operating at near maximum power. This is the most vulnerable phase of the flight, where there is no room for error. And then, it happens, the nameless act. Both fuel switches are flipped to the cutoff position. We don't know exactly what happened in the cockpit at that moment. Was there a silence on the CVR, or a faint click? Were any words spoken before that act? We don't know. We only know the result. The lifeblood that fed the two giant hearts of titanium and alloy was cut off. Seconds 20 to 30. The most observant passengers might have felt the first change. The familiar roar of the engines is gone. It is replaced by a faint whine, the sound of the giant turbine blades spinning from inertia. With no more thrust, the pressure on their backs disappears. The feeling of ascent is replaced by terrifying lurch. In the cockpit, hell begins. A cascade of warning lights would illuminate the control panel. The screens would display red messages of engine failure. And then, the sound that no pilot ever wants to hear at low altitude would ring out. A robotic, emotionless voice, repeating, "Stall, stall, stall." The aircraft is losing lift. It is no longer flying, it is starting to fall. It was likely during this period that the ghostly dialogue we spoke of took place. "Why did you do it?" "I didn't." A question and a denial amidst a storm of alarms. Seconds 30 to 40. When both engines lose power, and the aircraft's main electrical systems begin to fail, a final safety mechanism is activated, a mechanism that is the clearest evidence of a total catastrophe. It is the ram air turbine, or RAT. Imagine a small propeller, about the size of a lawnmower's blade, hidden in the fuselage. When the system senses that the aircraft has lost all power, it automatically deploys this propeller. The airflow from the falling aircraft spins this propeller, and it generates emergency electrical and hydraulic power, enough to keep the most basic flight control systems operational, enough for the pilots to try to steer the aircraft, now turned into a giant iron slug, to somewhere. The deployment of the RAT has a characteristic sound, a ghostly whir or whiz, completely different from the engine's roar. For pilots, it is the sound of total failure. It is the confirmation that they are in the worst imaginable situation. Mr. Pruchnicki said, "The deployment of the ram air turbine strongly supports the conclusion that both engines had failed." Seconds 40 to 50. At this point, another detail from the preliminary report becomes critically important. The landing gear was found in the down position, meaning it had not been retracted. Why? A Boeing 787 pilot explained in the BBC article. The gear retraction process is very fast, taking only about 8 seconds, and is usually completed by the time the aircraft reaches about 400 feet. The fact that Flight 171's landing gear was still out shows one thing: the catastrophe happened so fast, so suddenly, before the pilots could even complete one of the most basic actions after takeoff. It paints a picture of instantaneous collapse, and it brings us to the psychological state of the crew. The pilot explained that when such a horrific incident occurs, the human reaction goes beyond being startled. You go numb, he said. In that moment, landing gear isn't your focus. Your mind is on one thing: the flight path. Where can I put this aircraft down safely? Try to put yourself in that position. You are falling. Your altitude is only a few hundred feet. Below you is a crowded city. There is no runway. There are no fields. There is no time. Your only choice is to choose where will cause the least damage. It's no longer a problem of flying skill. It's a horrific ethical problem, playing out in a matter of seconds. Numbness, that is perhaps the most accurate word, an overload of the nervous system, as the human brain is not designed to process such a complete and sudden collapse. Years of training in simulators can prepare you for the procedures, but nothing can prepare you for the emotional state, for the numb feeling when you know it's all over. Seconds 50 to impact, but they did not give up. The data shows one final, desperate effort. The fuel switches were flipped back to the run position. The pilots tried to restart the engines, Perhaps the left engine first, then the right. It was like trying to strike a match in a hurricane. One engine began to show signs of recovery, its blades starting to spool up again, but it was too late. There was no more altitude. Time had run out. The thrust was insufficient. The report states, "Too little, too late." Those are the final words in the anatomy of a fall. We have just gone through less than 60 seconds together, but it feels as if a century has passed. A chain of events that began with a nameless act and ended in a hopeless effort. All of us, in our lives, are taught or praised for fighting to the end, for never giving up. But when the end is just the space of a few heartbeats, when the sky and the ground are switching places, what meaning do those lessons still hold? I wonder, and perhaps you're wondering too, if it were me in that seat, could I have done anything different? Could I have flipped that switch 1 second faster? Or would I too have been paralyzed by the unbelievable truth unfolding before my eyes? Where is our true limit? That thin line between the reflex trained over thousands of hours and the paralysis of horror? Between the reason of an expert and the survival instinct of a falling human? I don't have an answer for myself. What about you? In such an unimaginable situation, where do you think your reason and your instincts would take you? Please share your honest reflections in the comments. The fall is over. The explosion has faded into the past. But for those left behind, a silence even more terrifying than the roar of the dying engines begins. In the final part, we will listen to the echoes in that silence. Echoes in the silence. The fall is over. In the last part, we dissected the final 60 seconds of Flight 171 together. We heard the screams of the warning systems, felt the terrifying silence when the engines quit, and imagined the crew's desperate efforts in their final moments. But after the final explosion on the ground, after the flames were extinguished and the smoke cleared, what was left was not peace. What was left was a silence. A heavy silence that enveloped everything. The silence in homes where empty chairs would never be filled. The silence on phones that would never be answered. The silence in futures that were erased in just 1 minute. Tonight, we will no longer be in the cockpit. We will be on the ground, with those who remain, and we will try to listen to the echoes within that silence. When a tragedy occurs, the first need of the survivors, of the victims' families, is not compensation, not condolences. The first and most instinctual need is an answer. Why? It is the most fundamental human question. Why did this happen? Who is responsible? How can we prevent it from ever happening again? They waited for weeks, then months. They waited for the investigators, the experts from around the world, to piece together the wreckage, to decode the black boxes, and to bring them the one thing they needed, the truth. And then, the preliminary report was released, a document hundreds of pages long, full of technical terms, numbers, and charts. In the BBC article, a man named Imtiaz Ali, who lost his brother, sister-in-law, and their 2 young children on the flight. Read that report carefully. He read it with all the hope that he would find an explanation, something to hold on to in his grief, and this is what he said after he finished. He said that the report, to him, reads like a product description. Let that phrase sink in. A tragedy that took his entire family, and the official document explaining it made him feel like he was reading the user manual for a refrigerator. That statement, more than anything, reveals an abyss, the abyss between data and meaning, between technical truth and human truth. The report can tell you the engine thrust, the aircraft's angle of attack, the hydraulic system pressure. It accurately describes what happened to the machine, but it is completely silent on the question of why it happened to the people inside it. It doesn't bring comfort, it doesn't bring closure, it only brings more questions, wrapped in cold, distant language, and that is the paradox of the black boxes. We create them as omniscient scribes. The orange box is designed to survive fire, water, the most horrific impacts, with a single mission, to record the absolute truth. They are emotionless, unbiased witnesses. They do not lie. But the story of Flight 171 shows us a different, more unsettling truth. Sometimes, perfect data does not lead to perfect understanding. Sometimes, it just gives us a perfect mystery. The cockpit voice recorder gave us a dialogue, but it didn't tell us who spoke, in what tone, or in what context. It gave us a riddle, not an answer. The flight data recorder told us that the fuel switches were flipped, but it couldn't tell us by whose hand, or by what ghost command from the system. We have created machines to record the truth, but we forget that human truth doesn't just lie in data. It lies in intent, in context, in what is left unsaid. Humans don't need data. Humans need a story with a cause and effect, a story with a beginning, middle, and end. As Aristotle said, we need a story to be able to sort through the chaos, to be able to find some meaning in tragedy. The frustration of Imtiaz Ali and hundreds of other families comes from this very thing. They were handed the pieces of a puzzle, when what they needed was a complete story. And perhaps, there is one piece that could have completed that story, a piece that wasn't there. The investigators, faced with the silence of the data, said that this accident once again highlights the need for something that the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board has long recommended: cockpit video recorders. An unblinking eye, a small camera, placed in a position to observe the entire control panel and the actions of the pilots. A silent witness that never blinks. If there had been such an eye on Flight 171, perhaps we wouldn't need to be here tonight. Speculating, there would be no mystery. We would know exactly which hand moved. We would see the expressions on the pilots' faces. We would know if it was an intentional act, a mistake, or an involuntary spasm. All theories would be confirmed or dismissed. All questions about human action would have an answer. The debate over cockpit cameras has raged for years. Pilot associations often oppose it, citing privacy concerns. They argue that being constantly recorded would create a stressful working environment, and that the tapes could be misused or misinterpreted by the media and the public. Those are reasonable concerns, but for the families of the 260 victims, perhaps those privacy concerns become small when weighed against their burning need for the truth. For them, that unblinking eye is not an intrusion, but a promise that the sacrifice of their loved ones will not become an unsolvable riddle. Without it, the ghost of Flight 171, whether it is a ghost in the human mind or a ghost in the machine's blueprint, will never be truly identified. It will haunt the archives of aviation forever, a story without an end. Ultimately, this accident is not just a story about Air India. It is a parable for the modern world we live in, a world run by complex systems, black boxes to which we entrust our lives and futures every day. From the algorithms that decide the news you read, the financial systems that control your savings, to the automated machines that take you across continents, we live by faith in these black boxes, and we only realize the fragility of that faith when the system, for some reason, suddenly falls silent, and when we open it up to find answers, all we get is an echo. If the final truth is never found, what do we do with the remaining pain and doubt? Is accepting that some stories have no end, that some questions have no answers, a part of being human, or is the relentless search for answers, however hopeless, the very thing that honors the memory of those who were lost? Leave your final thoughts in the comments. Thank you for staying awake with Sleepless Mind. Your companionship on long nights like this is the greatest motivation. If you feel connected to our stories, please leave a like to let us know, and hit subscribe so you don't miss our next late night session. Tonight, before you sleep, try looking up at the sky. When you see a small point of light gliding peacefully across, perhaps you'll have another thought, not fear, but a quiet appreciation for the complexity, the trust, and the fragility of every single flight. May you have a deep sleep. The black box of the heart. At the end of our previous journey, we stopped before a promise, a potential solution to the silence, the unblinking eye of the cockpit video camera, a perfect mechanical witness that could perhaps answer our biggest question: who, or what, flipped those two fateful switches? Tonight, I want us to take one more step, to enter into a final experiment of the mind. Let's assume that on Flight 171 that day, there was such a camera, and that we, somehow, have obtained the final recording. We sit in a dark room, press play, and look at the screen. What would we see? Scene 1. The scenario of an accident. Perhaps we would see a moment of minor chaos, an unusual vibration not recorded by the FDR. The co-pilot, who was flying the plane, slightly loses his balance. His hand, in an effort to steady himself, accidentally hits the top of the two switches. Perhaps, as the FAA bulletin had warned, the safety lock mechanism was not engaged. An unintentional act, a horrific coincidence of physics and misfortune. On the screen, we would see the eyes of the other pilot widen, not in anger, but in utter bewilderment. He doesn't understand what just happened, and his question, "Why did you do it?" is not an accusation, but a desperate cry of confusion. The denial, "I didn't," is also completely genuine, because in the co-pilot's mind, he truly didn't do anything. It was an accident, a mystery solved by a cruel twist of fate. Scene 2. The scenario of confusion. Or perhaps, we would see something else. No vibrations, the cockpit is completely normal, but in an inexplicable moment, perhaps due to a micro-sleep lasting only a second, or a momentary lapse in concentration, a pilot's hand moves. He might have intended to flip another switch, but placed his hand in the wrong position, and then, we would see the most horrific moment on his own face. Not denial, but realization, his eyes widening, his mouth agape in silence as he comprehends what he has just done. An irreversible mistake. The action of flipping the switches back to the run position moments later wasn't his colleagues, but his own, a desperate attempt to turn back time. In this case, the dialogue on the CVR might never have happened, replaced by a silence even more terrifying than words. Scene 3. The scenario of a rebellious machine. And there is a third possibility, one that forces us to question our faith in technology. On the screen, we see the two pilots working normally. Their hands are in the correct positions. Their eyes are on the parameters. And then, we see it, the two fuel switches move on their own. No hand touches them. They flip down decisively, as if controlled by an invisible hand. We would see both pilots turn to look at each other, their faces holding not accusation, but only a primal fear, the fear of realizing that the machine they trusted has betrayed them. They are no longer in control. They are merely prisoners in a falling iron cage. The question, "Why did you do it?" might never be asked, because both of them know that neither of them did it. The accusation is not aimed at each other, but at the machine itself. Do we get our answer? Yes, technically, we would know what happened. An accident, a mistake, or a system failure. The mystery of the physical act would be solved. But would we truly understand if it were an intentional act? The darkest scenario, the camera could show us the action, but it could never show us what was happening in that person's mind for weeks. For months prior, it cannot record the despair, the anger, or any psychological ghost that led to that act. If it were a mistake, the camera could show us the error, but it could not show us the split-second moment the brain disconnected. And if it were a system failure, the camera would only show us human helplessness. It could not show us the flawed line of code or the short-circuited chip. The unblinking eye of the camera, in the end, can only record the physical world. It cannot record what takes place inside another black box, a black box far more complex and mysterious than any device ever made by man. It is the black box of the heart, the black box of human consciousness. We cannot rewind a thought. We cannot analyze the data of an emotion. We cannot decode a motive. There is no device that can record the silent abyss that exists inside every human being. Even in our own lives, do we truly understand why we do the things we do? Why on a beautiful day, you might feel a nameless sadness? Why you suddenly get angry over something trivial? Why you love someone without being able to explain it? Our consciousness is an ocean, and what we perceive is merely the ripples on the surface. Below are the currents, the abysses, the strange creatures that even we ourselves can never fully explore. If we cannot even decode our own black boxes under normal conditions, how can we ever hope to understand what happened in the minds of two men in a span of less than a minute? Under unimaginable pressure, as death was rushing toward them at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Perhaps the final lesson that Flight 171 leaves us with is not a lesson in engineering or safety procedures. It is a lesson in humility. Humility before the complexity of the machines we create, and even more humility before the infinite mystery of the human mind. It teaches us that sometimes, an answer is not what we should be looking for. Sometimes, the most important thing is to learn to live with the questions. How do we do that? How can families like Imtiaz Ali's find peace when the story of their loved ones has no end? Perhaps healing doesn't come from finding a person or a thing to blame. Hate and anger can provide a temporary sense of release, but they are also a prison, locking us forever in the past. Perhaps healing comes from redirecting that energy. Instead of asking why did it happen, we start asking what can we do to make sure it never happens again? And that is when the voices of the families become the most powerful. They are no longer passive victims of a tragedy. They become advocates, fighters for change. The fight for cameras to be installed in cockpits. The fight for safety bulletins to be taken more seriously. The fight for pilots' mental health to be given the attention it deserves. In doing so, they transform the silence of the black boxes into the voice of change. They turn personal pain into a public legacy. They cannot find meaning in the deaths, but they create meaning from the deaths. They cannot complete the story of the past, but they are writing a new story for the future. When faced with an unsolvable tragedy, what do we choose to do? Try to fill the void of silence with speculation and anger, or learn to accept that silence and listen to the lessons its very echoes leave behind? Leave your final thoughts in the comments. Thank you for staying awake with Sleepless Mind through this long and complex journey. Your patience and contemplation are the greatest inspiration. If stories like this help you see the world through different eyes, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to explore the other mysteries of life together. The night is now very late. Look out the window. Perhaps you'll see a small point of light gliding across the sky. Think of the two souls in that cockpit. Think of the complexity of the machine they command, and the mystery of the hearts they carry, and send them, and all those who were lost, a peaceful thought. Sleep well. You've crossed the story. You felt every pulse in the dark. And I was there with you, quietly. Always. That's why I left behind one last thing. Not to explain, not to impress, just to stay with you a little longer. A song I chose with care, as if tucking you in from across time and space. So go on, lay back, the music knows where to take you. you're still here, then you're something rare. Not many stay this long. So, thank you for choosing to stay. I'm here too, still awake, surrounded by the quiet glow of my editing screen, shaping the next stories just for you. If there's anything you want to leave behind, a whisper, a suggestion, even just a symbol, drop it in the comments. Because maybe, tomorrow night, you'll hear yourself echoed in a story that's never been told before. Still here, even now? I have a feeling part of you is still wandering somewhere between wakefulness and dreaming. I know that feeling well because I'm still awake with you. In a quiet room, I'm gently laying out layers of sound, each breath, each beat, preparing the next journey we'll take together. If you're still listening, leave me a sign. Let me know how you're feeling or just where you are in this vast world. Because right now, in this stillness, you are not alone. You're still there, aren't you? I can't see you, but I can feel you. Like a soft signal pulsing across the silence. Over here, I'm still working, refining layers of sound, rewriting fragments of voice, building the landscape for our next adventure. One that you might inspire. If an idea comes to you, share it with me. Comment below, a theme, a memory, a strange dream. I read every word, because I never tell these stories alone. I tell them with you.